But I'm really fond of yachts when I'm looking at them from dry land. You know, I think they look really pretty out there bobbing on the sea, but I don't know that I want to be bobbing on them.
Yeah, it is quite a remarkable thing to do, though, don't you think?
Oh, incredible. I mean, if it goes well, it will just be the most incredible adventure. But I guess the thing with adventures is you don't know how they're going to turn out.
No, but here's wishing Rob and the family all the very best and that it does go really well. I've included this because Stephen has been a beekeeper. Are you still?
We've still got the hives. I am no longer in partnership. I probably am not physically strong enough to be useful to the beekeeper any longer.
Really?
Anyway. Well, it's a very heavy business. That I used to go up and help, particularly at moving hives at night a bit, and some of partly was out of interest. But a full box is you could have 20 kilos, and hauling that stuff around, it's fine if you're doing it every day, but if you just go and do it at a weekend
on uneven ground, and
exactly,
yeah.
Okay. No, so I'm still actively involved in, and the farm is dependent on beekeeping, but I can't call myself a beekeeper.
Australia's biggest listed honey company and some of the country's largest supermarket chains face accusations of selling fake honey, says the Sydney Morning Herald. Testing at a leading international scientific lab has found nearly half the samples selected from supermarket shelves were adulterated, mixed with other substances, and adulterated honey is generally bulked up with rice syrup and beet syrup, which aren't detected by official tests. Criminal gangs in places like China produce the fake honey and make a fortune. Do you ever buy honey that tastes funny?
No, but I mean, I guess we do only buy New Zealand honey in New Zealand, so we're probably pretty safe.
Well, Consumer New Zealand says there have been, because we asked them today, there have been complaints about Manuka honey sold here and exported, and MPI has developed a Manuka honey science definition, a test which shows whether it's authentic, and this must be applied to all export honey.
But that's about its UMF, its activity level.
No, it's actually, it should be, or it should include that, but it doesn't.
It doesn't.
Actually, it's everything but that.
Oh.
And yet that UMF level is what the international market wants. So there's a real controversy about whether the MPI has just ducked the issue. But they do have, that their tests certainly should pick up if the Manuka honey is being, sugar syrup's being put into it, for example. And so I think the New Zealand honeys here are pretty likely to be kosher, to have what they say they have. But internationally, there was a stage where the industry heard that there was 4 times as much Manuka honey being sold in China as was produced. So there's an awful lot of fraud, and really it's going to take good science and dedicated spending on enforcement to get rid of that.
And is it true that the Manuka, the health benefits are more like wound care rather than eating it?
Yes, that's what Peter Molan, who was the professor at Waikato, strongly of the view that we should be careful about marketing it as a food, because its best use would be on hard to deal with wounds. Yep.
Just to add before we go that Consumer New Zealand does say it's consulting on whether this is MPI, on whether the standard should be applied domestically here and not unnaturally, says Consumer New Zealand. We think it should. Very good. Stephen Franks has been on the panel and Nikki Pellegrino with him today. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice to have your company, and thanks everybody. We're back tomorrow.
Tō te maira e hoa mā hei kōrero kei te haere hei kaupapa kei te karawhiua. Welcome to Checkpoint, everyone. Tonight, Auckland's Unitec confirms to Checkpoint at least 100 staff, possibly up to 200, will lose their jobs as it suspends 19 courses in full and 3 others in part for 2019. The announcement comes just a fortnight after the government announced the tertiary institution would get a $50 million loan. Wainuiomata High School gets a $24 million injection to fix its tired and leaking buildings, but beleaguered Labour MP Meka Whaitiri is nowhere to be seen, despite the school being in her electorate. A new report on life inside the Nauru Detention Centre details escalating trauma and abuse among refugees. We talked to one of the authors, and former Cadbury workers struggle to find work.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Bat and aho. At least 100 jobs are being axed at Unitec as the struggling Auckland tertiary institution suspends 19 courses in full and 3 others in part. Staff have been told the courses will be suspended from next year and for the foreseeable future. Unitec says it won't be enrolling any new students, but those currently enrolled will be able to complete their qualifications. Its interim chief executive, Mirren Davis, has told Checkpoint the courses are being suspended to help reduce costs by 20%. In July, the government replaced Unitec's council with a commissioner, and last month it gave the deeply indebted institution a loan of $50 million. Checkpoint will have more on this story. Some former workers at Dunedin's Cadbury factory are struggling to find decent jobs or any work at all, months after being made redundant. The factory closed at the end of March with the loss of 350 jobs when its multinational owner Mondelez moved production offshore. Teresa Gooch, who was with Cadbury for 17 years, has still not found a job. She says she started off looking for full-time work, but would now be grateful for any part-time or casual work she can get. A former workmate, Jason Welch, found work sorting parcels but says he now earns about half of what he earned at Cadbury. He says many of his former colleagues are in a similar situation. The Medical Council wants a roundtable discussion about the hotly debated new hospital rosters. District health boards are rolling out rosters intended to provide safer working hours for junior doctors following a pay deal with their union last year. But a research report released to RNZ details significant costs to DHBs from the rosters, plus a serious impact on training and issues with care handovers. The Council's chair, Andrew Connolly, says there are questions that should be resolved.
There's unintended consequences, I think, because of the rosters, and there's also a growing perception issue that the rosters are therefore going to cause more problems, but we don't know that yet because a lot of the doctors haven't gone on to them.
Andrew Connolly of the Medical Council. Parents and early childhood teachers in the Greater Wellington area say they're frustrated by long delays in help for preschoolers with disabilities. The Education Ministry says the region's average waiting time for early intervention is 6 months, double the national average. Our education correspondent John Gerritsen reports.
Wellington parents have told RNZ News the waiting times are jaw-dropping and ridiculous. Teachers say some children are waiting nearly a year for help and then often get it for only a few months before going to school. The ministry says Wellington region waiting times are long because of factors such as unfilled vacancies. It says the government's budget earlier this year included extra funding that will help it more than halve the number of under 5-year-olds on the early intervention waiting list. Ko John Gerritsen tēnei.
The National Museum of Brazil has been consumed by fire, and much of its archive of 20 million items is believed to have been destroyed. The fire broke out in the Rio de Janeiro building when it was closed to the public for the day. Founded in 1818, it's Brazil's oldest and most important historical and scientific museum, and its director says its destruction is a cultural tragedy. A Myanmar judge has found 2 Reuters journalists guilty of breaching a law on state secrets and sentenced them to 7 years in prison. Wah Lone and Jaw Saw U were arrested and charged after investigating a massacre of 10 Rohingya Muslims by Myanmar security forces in northern Rakhine state. Their lawyers say they'll appeal against their sentences immediately. A detainee inside the Yonga Hill Detention Centre in Western Australia says he's scared there'll be more riots and people could get seriously hurt. Emergency services were deployed to a compound last night after detainees set fire to buildings following a self-harm incident. Ali Yusuf says he hid in a room with other detainees.
We ended up 7 people in one room hiding so we can help each other and stick together so we don't get actually hit or punch or get burned inside your room by yourself or getting jumped because you're by yourself, and we hiding in the room and we just watching it from the window, everything lit up at the front of us and we couldn't do nothing.
Ali Yusuf, the Australian Border Force says all detainees and staff are safe and unharmed. It's 5 minutes past 5. To sport, then the Silver Ferns mid-quarter Laura Langman is returning to play for the Australian domestic netball champions, the Sunshine Coast Lightning. Netball New Zealand didn't allow her to play for the Ferns last year as she was based overseas. However, she took a break from the game this year, not playing in Australia or at international level. Netball New Zealand has now relaxed its eligibility qualifications and granted her a 12-month exemption, so she can now play in Australia and for the Silver Ferns. Had she not got the exemption, Langman's unsure what it would have meant for her 141 Test career.
I don't know, because it didn't come about. Who knows? I just feel very lucky to be afforded an exemption to be able to play both domestic netball over in Australia and then come back and represent New Zealand. So, it's something I haven't really thought about.
Laura Langman. The Breakers have released import player Jarrell Benamon from his contract even before the ANBL basketball season has begun. Signed as starting centre, he had been due to arrive at the club a few days ago, but family issues have kept him in the United States. And the defending women's champion Sloane Stephens has eased into the quarter-finals of the US Tennis Open with a straight sets win over Belgian Elise Mertens. That's the news.
First to get a new home.
It's great bang for buck. 1.5 bathrooms and 3 bedrooms, and there's ample storage.
Living next door to a new road.
We don't know what it's going to be like living next to a road. It could be well and truly horrible. I think financially, though, we probably can't afford to move.
And new rosters for doctors.
300 extra full-time equivalent junior doctors to fill the new rosters at the cost of more than $35 million.
Something new every morning. Morning Report with Susie Ferguson and Guy and Espinel, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, Earth is at risk of entering a hothouse climate. Researcher Will Stephan has led an international study on global warming and warned temperatures are continuing to rise. And after 10, former Prime Minister, head of the UN Development Programme, and Secretary-General aspirant Helen Clark talks about women, equality and power. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. For Northland to Whanganui, also Coromandel Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Showers, some heavy, with possible thunderstorms today. Clearing in the west from Northland to Taumaranui tomorrow evening. Snow may affect the Desert Road tonight and tomorrow morning. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, scattered showers turning to rain tomorrow with possible thunderstorms and hail. Manawatu to Wellington, also Wairarapa and Marlborough. Rain spreading north this evening, heavy at times, severe southerly gales in exposed places for a time. For Nelson Buller and North Westland, scattered rain, gradually clearing today. For the remainder of Westland, also Fiordland, fine apart from a few showers in southern Fiordland. Canterbury, Southland and Otago, a few showers mainly dry about central Otago, clearing south of Christchurch tomorrow. And for the Chatham Islands, occasional showers. It's just gone 5:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten. Sorry, I've only just arrived in the studio.
Yes, you have, John.
I went to
Yes.
South Island and knew I was in trouble. Thanks everyone for being with us. Really busy old Checkpoint tonight. Lots of stuff developing as we go to air, including this. Unitec is to lay off somewhere in excess of 100 staff, possibly more than double that number using money borrowed from the government as part of a support package announced a fortnight ago. Checkpoint confirmed the job losses after speaking to Unitec's interim chief executive shortly before we came on air. Unitec, an Auckland-based tertiary institution, has been in what the government calls extreme financial difficulty with substantial operating deficits. On the 23rd of August, Education Minister Chris Hipkins announced the government would provide Unitec with a $50 million loan but made no mention of job losses. But Checkpoint has been sent a copy of an internal Unitec document detailing 23 programs being cut in full or part, although the language it uses is more oblique. I asked Miriam Davis, the interim CEO of Unitec, for clarification.
Okay, so we've got about 20 programs and they include a range of certificate, diplomas and bachelor degrees and a couple of postgraduate qualifications. And essentially they are programs that we've been looking carefully at for some time on the basis of a mixture of their financial viability, their strategic relevance and their educational performance. And those the programs that, having gone through that process on a program by program basis, we do feel the programs that, looking at those areas are no longer fit for purpose and no longer is doing as well as they need to.
You are calling a spade an inverted digging implement, because I think it's tough for you to say the words, but you are dropping these programs, aren't you?
We are not taking enrolments in 2019, and we are currently looking at teaching those programs out on the whole. We are mindful, however, that there is the roadmap process also underway, which will have an impact on the direction of the sector.
Sorry, can I just... Sorry, Miriam, forgive me, can you just give us some clarity around the fact that the programs... And the list is too long to read out, but if we go through them in alphabetical order just to give us a sample, BA, Bachelor of Arts, is going. Bachelor of Communications with Language Studies as your major is going. Short courses in International Language, Bachelor of Communications, Master of International Communications, Doctor of Computering, Diploma in Contemporary Music, Master of Design, and on, all the list we have, they are all going. You will not take any further enrolments in them, and once the current students complete their degrees or diplomas or whatever, that's it.
That's right.
Did you tell the government then that these courses were going? Did the Minister, when he agreed to the $50 million loan, know that you were tightening your belt to this extent?
Absolutely. We have been working closely with TEC, who have been briefing the Minister. They do understand that we will have to make significant changes, not just to our portfolio, but across all areas of our business to actually return ourselves to a sustainable operating position by the end of next year. So they absolutely have been working, closely, and it will come as no shock, the moves that we are having to make with this regard, John.
How many jobs are being lost?
We're still working through that process. I mean, it's no secret that we need to look at cost reduction in the order of 20%, to the organisation. That includes looking at our operating processes and systems, at all of our operating expenditure, and of course, as we've been really upfront with staff and transparent, also looking at job losses as part of that picture.
Okay,
well.
In terms of being upfront and transparent, how many job losses are we talking about, ballpark?
Ballpark figure, we're expecting anywhere between 100 and a couple of hundred jobs, full-time equivalent jobs.
So 100 to 200 full-time equivalent jobs?
Yes.
Okay. So, and do those people know? Do people know yet that roughly 100 to 200 full-time equivalent jobs will go? Because if they're full-time equivalent, then that's actually more people, isn't it? Because that involves part-time jobs.
Yes, and staff are well aware that we are looking right across the organisation. There's already a number of change proposals. I mean, for example, we started at the top. We had 8 members on the executive leadership team. We now have 4. And so, right across the organisation, there is an understanding and an expectation that there will be job losses.
I guess, yeah, clearly there is, because the deficits are so high. They're very substantial. But the theoretical understanding that there will be job losses is not the same as people knowing specifically that their jobs are going to be lost. Do people, for example, if you are getting rid of the BA full stop, do those people know that they are going?
People that are impacted by the program changes, and you'll appreciate that we're right in the middle of that process currently, John, and we're working through the impact. We haven't got detailed change proposals for the affected staff.
Have you gone to staff, Miriam, have you gone to staff and said there is a restructuring taking place and your job is one of those in the 100 to 200 full-time equivalents that we are losing?
We are in the process of doing that. There is a number of staff across Unitec that have already had those conversations and know they're impacted. For example, we have gone to the senior academic leadership in terms of our deans and head of pathways. They realise that there will be an academic design which they are actually involved in co-designing, that their roles will be disestablished. So certainly we're at the point that we're able to. We have talked about relentless communication. We've talked about being transparent, and I believe that, staff, if you were to talk to our staff, that on the whole they would actually talk about leadership and management taking that approach, John.
Does the Minister, the Education Minister Chris Hipkins, know that there's 100 to 200 full-time equivalent jobs going?
I believe he is aware of that, yes.
Okay, so there will be costs attached to redundancies. How will that work? Is part of the $50 million loan that you are securing from the government? Obviously, you don't want to run in deficit, but is part of the $50 million loan to meet the costs of laying people off?
Yes, it is.
That's Miriam Davis, who is the interim Chief Executive of Unitec. The Education Minister, Chris Hipkins, declined to be interviewed, but in a statement we received just a few minutes ago, said, and I quote, "The $50 million Crown loan for Unitec is to ensure that it could keep its doors open. The independent financial advisor at Unitec has advised me that it's expected to enrol about 6,900 EFTSs in 2018, with further declines expected in 2019. This is significantly less than what Unitec had forecast, and I understand there will need to be a reduction in staffing numbers as a result." The Commissioner, Murray Strong, is currently working through the process to ensure the organisation is sustainable, and any implication on staffing is yet to be determined. So that's what the Minister's saying, any implication is yet to be determined. It sounds to us like the Unitec are further down the track than that. We would love to hear from Unitec staff about where they believe they stand and what they have been told about their jobs. Do text us 2101. We're happy to deal with you in confidence. It's 17 minutes past 5. He sang about jail, but today he got home detention. Lovepreet Brar, the man behind an online Hindi pop sensation, has been sentenced to 11 months home detention for taking bribes for New Zealand driver licences. Brar took more than 100 bribes and pocketed tens of thousands of dollars. In some cases, people who didn't even sit the test were able to buy a driver's licence and get behind the wheel. Our court reporter Edward Gay filed this report.
The song is called Jail. Lovepreet Brar's music video depicts a character who lives in a showy house, owns flash cars, carries guns and has just been shot in the shoulder. It's had over 4.3 million hits on YouTube. But today Brar was in the Manukau District Court to be sentenced after admitting a representative charge of obtaining by deception. He worked for the Automobile Association as a customer service consultant, processing paperwork and taking money from people who wanted to sit their driver's licence tests. Judge Anna Johns said Brar was recruited into a group who were taking bribes in exchange for licences in 2014. The bribe payers would often make contact with him by text message.
By way of a bribe payment, a price was agreed upon, which was typically $400 if the applicant attended and sat their IR or IF driving test, and up to $550 if the applicant did not attend, and between $1,500 and $2,500 for a Class 2 to 5 truck licence.
At its worst, the scheme had the potential to allow people to drive heavy trucks on the open roads without having to sit the required test. Judge Johns said the applicants would then book their licence either online or at the centre.
Once the time and date had been obtained, you would communicate with the corrupt testing officers who knew to pass the person regardless of their attendance or driving ability.
The Transport Agency operates a program called Book 10, which produces a schedule of applicants and allocates them a testing instructor at random. But the group got around that by meeting in the lunchroom.
You and your co-defendants would search for specific driver licence applicants and swap them to allow a match between the bribe-paying applicant and a corrupt testing officer who knows to pass them.
If that couldn't be managed, Brar and his co-accused would approach the testing officer and ask for them to go easy on the applicant. Brar was involved in at least 107 corrupt transactions between 2014 and 2016. He received over $56,000 in bribes. More bribe money was passed on to his co-defendants. The Crown pointed to the serious breach of trust, the large amount of money involved, and the public safety issues. Bra's lawyer, Steve Bonner QC, said his client was relatively young. He described the pre-sentence report as not helpful.
While there is clear risk to the community as a result of the offending, I suggest that maybe putting it a little high to say that there is potential for fatality is immense.
In sentencing, Judge Johns described Bra as a 25-year-old with potential. She gave him time off for his previous good record and his early guilty pleas.
And I end with a warning, Mr Bra, you come back for any kind of dishonesty offending and you will go to prison. You understand that? Yes, thank you. Stand down.
Bra will carry out his sentence at a modest brick and tile address in Takanini, not the palatial residence his music video was filmed at. 3 other defendants are still before the courts. Mo te hō taka o te ahi ko Edward Gaiaho.
21 minutes past 5. The sidelined Labour MP Meka Whaitiri appears to have gone to ground while she's under investigation regarding a staffing matter in her ministerial office. Ms Whaitiri has been stripped of her ministerial portfolios, responsibilities, while allegations are investigated that she pushed her new press secretary. The Ikaroa Rāwhiti MP was missing in action this morning at an education announcement by the Prime Minister in Lower Hutt, which is part of Ms Whaitiri's electorate. Our political reporter Joe Moya went along.
Wainuiomata High School students welcoming the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, Education Minister Chris Hipkins, Labour MP Ginny Anderson and Speaker of the House and Wainuiomata local Trevor Mallard. The occasion? The school is getting $24 million to redevelop its tired and leaky buildings. But one politician was notable by her absence. Meka Whaitiri was nowhere to be seen despite the school falling in her Ikaroa Rāwhiti electorate. Instead, the MP will be spending the first week since she was stood down from her ministerial responsibilities in her electorate, rather than facing the music at Parliament.
Of course, her role continues on as a Member of Parliament, whether or not she's in Wellington or in her home constituency.
Jacinda Ardern has described the issue as a staffing matter in Ms Whaitiri's ministerial office. The matter is now being investigated by Ministerial Services, and while it's going on, the MP will instead be based in her Gisborne electorate office, where she's continuing to be paid a ministerial salary. The ACT leader David Seymour says that's not good enough.
Why is she getting paid if she's not working? If she's liable to be dismissed, why should she continue on a full ministerial salary? She should stop being paid that salary, and if she's exonerated, then she can be back paid. But she shouldn't be able to keep claiming the salary while people work out what she's done.
Jacinda Ardern defended Meka Whaitiri's absence at the Wainuiomata High School announcement, saying there are many parts of her electorate she could be at today. While Ms Whaitiri has been stripped of her ministerial work, she remains co-chair of the Labour Māori caucus, something her fellow MP Willie Jackson told News Hub Nation was completely reasonable.
She is still the MP for Ikaroa Rāwhiti. She is still the co-chair, along with myself, for the Māori caucus. I think all New Zealanders would think that there's got to be an investigation and a process to go through before we try and shut Meka Whaitiri down, who's made a great contribution not just to the Māori caucus over the years, but to the Labour Party.
Jacinda Ardern agrees.
She stood aside from ministerial portfolios. All of her other roles remain for the time of the investigation.
Jacinda Ardern was keener to focus on what was going on at Wainuiomata High School. She told the students that $12 million had been promised for an upgrade under the last government, but she was going one better.
We don't think that's enough. We don't think that that's going to give you and your school and your teachers and your community what you deserve. And so that's why it's my pleasure to be here today to say that we are going to double that and give you $24 million.
Ms Ardern told the gymnasium packed full of students that visiting schools was her favourite thing to do as Prime Minister. That's not a surprise after a fortnight of having to deal with demoting Broadcasting Minister Claire Curran from Cabinet and then the allegations against Meka Whaitiri. In Wainuiomata, for Checkpoint, Joe Moya.
Let's head to Nauru now, venue for this year's Pacific Island Forum, South Pacific Forum, but also the location for one of Australia's migrant processing centres. A new report on life inside the centres is detailing escalating trauma and abuse among refugees and an increasingly desperate situation. The joint report by the Refugee Council of Australia and the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre says children as young as 7 are experiencing repeated suicide thoughts. And there's been a big rise in the number needing medical treatment. The report's been released today for maximum impact as the Pacific leaders begin gathering for the forum. This report from the ABC.
Australia has a long relationship with Nauru, the island being a place where asylum seekers are sent when refused entry. But Jana Favero from the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre says the real fallout from detention processing facilities on Nauru has only become clear in the last few months.
Things really have escalated. So this is the first time that we've been able to sort of sit down and evaluate the scale of that impact. Also, we've just had 3 whistleblowers who have recently left Nauru who are speaking out and telling us that they do fear a child is about to die on Nauru. They're seeing neglect there and they're seeing levels of trauma that they haven't experienced beforehand.
The processing centre was reopened by the Gillard Labor government in September 2012 and is the focus of a report titled Australia's Man-Made Crisis on Nauru 6 years on. The advocates say there are still 109 children in detention on Nauru. The Asylum Seeker Resource Centre and Refugee Council of Australia argue a growing number of children are showing symptoms of traumatic withdrawal syndrome. Symptoms include stopping eating, refusing to speak and resisting medical care.
We've seen 25 cases where lawyers have had to intervene based on medical evidence and court have ordered or there's been interlocutory injunction where children have been flown off. We know that there are another 50 children where there's an overseas medical transfer that's been put into place and requested by doctors on Nauru and that Australian Border Force is blocking those.
The report says children as young as 7 have been attempting suicide, in some cases dousing themselves in petrol and setting themselves alight. Louise Newman from the group Doctors for Justice says this week's Pacific Islands Forum in Nauru must mark an end to the political manoeuvring.
This is an embarrassment at the very least. It's an eyesore, and I think having national heads actually discuss whether this in any way is sustainable is going to be important.
Whether there's an appetite for leaders to discuss this at the forum remains unclear. On Saturday, the president of Nauru, Baron Waga, told Sky News advocates were encouraging refugee children to self-harm.
These kids are pushed into doing something that they don't, they're not aware of or the dangers of. And if that is the case, then we are extremely worried.
But Louise Newman says the rise in cases of traumatic withdrawal syndrome is entirely predictable in that type of environment. She says the president's comments reflect an ongoing pattern of no one wanting to take responsibility for the situation.
And there's no way that symptoms such as unconsciousness and deep coma can be feigned or induced by anyone. It's a very serious condition and it is actually life-threatening.
That report from the ABC, Louise Newman, ending it there. The Foreign Affairs Minister, Winston Peters, says he will wait to establish the facts before responding to that new report outlining the situation for children at the refugee camp in Nauru. It's a detention centre, isn't it? Mr Peters touched down on the island this afternoon ahead of the Pacific Islands Forum being held there this week. The Prime Minister won't be arriving until Wednesday and will be there for just a day. Mr Peters told reporters that nothing has changed in terms of New Zealand's offer to Australia to take 150 of the refugees.
Not here to litigate whether or not we should take on more refugees from here or anywhere else, because that is in the control of the Australian and the Nauruan governments, and I'm not going to interfere with that. Also, we understand the United States, as a result of the UN Commission with respect to refugees, has made a long-term commitment, which President Trump says he will honour, and that's where things sit at the moment.
The Government of Australia today outlined some pretty horrible things that the refugee children are facing here. Talk of pouring petrol over themselves. How do we intervene in this situation?
Well, first of all, we'll find out whether that sort of statement is a fact, and then no doubt we'll be on to hear from the Nauruan government as to whether or not there's anything that's to do with the institution here which has brought that about. Self-immolation is not unknown in these circumstances, and let's not throw allegations around without any facts at all.
Mr Peters, do you expect to be meeting with or being exposed to the issues around refugees as
Prime Minister?
The next 3 days? Yes.
In what capacity?
Well, we'll find out.
Do you expect the new Australian leadership to be more open to New Zealand's offer of 150 refugees?
Well, they know that it's on the table. Scott Morrison has been the Treasurer of Australia a long time before he became the Prime Minister, so he'd know that. They would know what the costings are, so there's nothing unusual about that. So that's where things sit at the moment.
So you expect no change, essentially? No change to the stance?
Well, look, I can't speak for the Australians. I can't speak for a new Prime Minister.
Winston Peters talking to media this afternoon. After 6, we're going to talk to the President of the Refugee Council of Australia, the organisation behind this report. He gives an extraordinary, angry interview and tries to get to the bottom of what the Australian Parliament is playing at. Remember, there is bipartisan support for these detention centres, offshore detention centres. If you have any interest in it, I do recommend you listen. Checkpoint after 6. But at the moment, it is still only 5:30, so if I race through the headlines, we'll be on time. Brace yourself, KB. 2 Reuters journalists have been found guilty of breaching a law on state secrets. They were, in fact, doing fantastic work. They've been sentenced to 7 years in a Myanmar prison. Key parts of the Pike River mine's electrical infrastructure could have survived the multiple explosions that killed 29 people almost 8 years ago, which is why they want to get up the drift and finding jobs after losing work at Cadbury. All of that coming up before 6. Here's Katrina with the 5:30 headlines.
Between 100 and 200 jobs are set to be axed at Auckland's deeply indebted tertiary institution, Unitec. The Polytechnic will fully suspend 19 courses from next year and for the foreseeable future. Unitec says there won't be any new enrolments, but current students will be able to complete their qualifications. In July, the government replaced Unitec's council with a commissioner and last month loaned it $50 million. The Medical Council wants to have a round-table discussion about the widely disputed new hospital rosters. District health boards are rolling out revised rosters that are supposed to provide safer working hours for junior doctors after last year's pay deal. But a research report shows there are significant costs to DHBs from the rosters, as well as a serious impact on training and handovers. A former Automobile Association worker has escaped jail after admitting taking bribes in exchange for issuing driver's licences. Lovepreet Brar was sentenced to 11 months home detention today in the Manukau District Court, having earlier pleaded guilty to a representative charge of obtaining by deception. Judge Anna John said in 2014 he was recruited into a group who were taking bribes in exchange for licences. She said Brar took 107 bribes and kept $56,000 for himself. She warned him any further offending would mean a prison sentence. A judge in Myanmar has found 2 Reuters journalists guilty of breaching a law on state secrets and sentenced them to 7 years in prison, while Lone and Jaw Saw U was charged after investigating a massacre of 10 Rohingya Muslims by Myanmar security forces in northern Rakhine State. Their lawyers say they'll appeal immediately. A severe weather warning is in place for Wellington, the Marlborough Sounds and the Kaikoura coast, which can expect strong southerlies until tomorrow morning. The Blue Bridge Inter-Islander ferry has cancelled 4 sailings today and 2 8 o'clock sailings tomorrow morning. And tonight's 6:45 and 8:30 sailings of the Inter-Islander will carry only freight, which is probably a good idea. Those are headlines.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina. Let's turn to business news now with Nona Peltier's back this week. Nice to have you back with us, Nona. Restaurant Brands is selling the Starbucks coffee franchise in New Zealand. Not for a huge sum of money, eh, Nona?
No, but don't forget they're not really selling anything but leases and some business equipment and, you know, the brand. They're not going to be managing it anymore. And it was up for negotiation anyway. They had to renew the license next year. So there's not a lot of life left in it anyway for the company. So they're selling it for $4.4 million to a consortium of Maestro cafes and 2 investment firms. They're going to be buying it through a new company. And they'll be running it. And they're offering, I understand, the staff and so on will be offered the same terms and conditions as they currently have.
How many are there?
About 300. There's 22 stores in New Zealand, and the new company suggesting that they will, open a few more, renovate them and so on, refurbish them, invest a bit more than Restaurant Brands was interested in doing. Restaurant Brands, they're really focused on KFC, Pizza Hut. They also have the Taco Bell brand in parts of the Pacific and Hawaii, and some people are hoping that they'll bring that here. So with this new focus on fast food could happen. We'll see.
Yeah, they've had a good run, restaurant brands, haven't they? Big
well, you know, Starbucks wasn't a big part of their business. It was like, with sales last year fell a little bit to $26 million dollars, so it's not a big deal.
Legal battle between Fisher and Paykel Healthcare and its rival ResMed has flared up again. Gosh, this is like a Victorian bushfire in some reason. It never really goes out.
And it is a bigger deal, obviously, because, you know, Fisher and Paykel have been fighting with this company for a while. So what's the story with that? ResMed is a competitor, direct competitor for masks. So what does Fisher & Paykel sell? These masks that people use for sleeping disorders like sleep apnea, that kind of thing. And so they've been fighting with these folks for, a couple of years now in courts in New Zealand, Australia, Germany, the UK, and of course the United States.
I reckon we've talked about it half a dozen times.
Yeah, and so this latest battle is basically probably a little bit more serious, because this particular company, ResMed, is a US-based company, and they have filed a complaint with the United States Trade Commission in a U.S. District Court, saying that they want damages and they want Fisher & Paykel's masks to be blocked from being imported into the United States, full stop. And as you know, with the trade tensions that are going off, this can't be a good thing for Fisher & Paykel. And certainly it is reflected in the share price. We've seen that fall nearly 4% today to $15.75. Whereas Restaurant Brands was a little changed, up just a cent. Now, overall, the trade worries that have overshadowed industry here too, and our dollar has really was ramped up over the weekend when Donald Trump sort of took a swipe at Canada over the NAFTA talks, which are not going very well. Our Kiwi fell to 66.1. Well, 66.1 US cents is where it's at now. So that's a step down from, last week around 67. 91.8 Australian and 51 British pence. But overall, our top 50 index, it ended down again with this negative sentiment, down 0.6%. And that's 56 points to 9,257. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. We'll expect to see some news over the course of the week, which will tell us which way the wind is blowing.
Nona Peltier, thanks very much. Nona's with us all week this week. That's right, isn't it? Here in RNZ Auckland. Let's go to Dunedin. Former workers at Dunedin's Cadbury factory are struggling to find decent jobs, or any work at all for some of them, months after being made redundant. The factory closed at the end of March with the loss of 350 jobs after US food giant Mondelez moved production offshore. As of June, only half of the workers had found new jobs, according to their union, and that, it says, is a typical outcome for many people who get made redundant, with little support available to recognise their skills or help them into equivalent new jobs. It's tough. In other words, Kate Newton filed this report.
So yeah, there's one I applied for. It was a no-go. Unsuccessful, at least they answered back. Haven't heard from them guys yet.
After 17 years at the Cadbury factory, Teresa Gooch worked her last shift in March. Months later, she's still looking for a new job.
Well, some days I'm 8-9 hours on the computer just searching through, applying for jobs. Yeah, it's hard to sort of go away and do anything because I feel like I'm wasting time and not looking for a job.
Teresa started off looking for full-time work, but has lowered her sights as the weeks of unemployment drag on.
Most of the positions advertised are part-time and casual, and because I'm on my own, a single parent, and I have a mortgage, I didn't really apply for the casual part-time positions. But I guess I'm realising now that I need to take the casual part-time option.
Teresa's former colleague, Jason Welch, who's been a senior machine operator for nearly 2 decades, did manage to find work a few weeks after finishing at Cadbury. But his new job, sorting parcels, has seen his pay packet slashed in half.
The money's just above minimum wage, just above minimum wage. It's one of those things you don't want to be wasting your redundancy, so it was take what you could get.
The 41-year-old, who has 2 teenage children and a mortgage to pay, says many of his former workmates are in a similar position.
There'll be a lot of people that took jobs just so that they didn't have to spend their redundancy, myself included, that really aren't about what they're doing now, but they're doing what they're doing to make the money so they don't neglect commitments at home, money-wise and family-wise.
Teresa and Jason are among the thousands of New Zealanders who get made redundant each year when businesses close or are restructured. Research by the OECD and think tank Motu shows that 4 years after redundancy, workers were earning up to 12% less than those who never lost their jobs. First Union Secretary Rob Reid says Jason and Teresa's experiences are typical of people who get made redundant.
But it is not typical of what is happening in many other OECD countries where funds are there for workers to have that training under proper career guidance, and they are not sitting down then after redundancy getting lower and lower expectations of the type of work that they can do. That's an absolute waste of that person's life and an absolute waste for the economy as well.
The OECD ranks New Zealand in the bottom third for spending on what are known as active labour market policies to get people into meaningful, well-paid work. It says Work and Income tends to focus its efforts on low-skilled people who've been on benefits for a long time, often leaving better-skilled workers to fend for themselves when it comes to finding a job. In May, the government announced it would seek help from unions and business leaders on policies to help workers whose industries are threatened by climate change into other jobs. Mr Reid says those policies should extend to all workers.
We need to get these principles of just transition, yes, definitely for mine workers, power generation workers who are losing their jobs because of changes that need to be made for the reasons of climate change, but really for any worker who loses their job.
Back in Dunedin, Jason Welch is still wondering what his future holds.
You want something that's going to fulfil you, that's going to make you feel whole, that makes you feel like you're important to your community, to your people around you, that make you feel like your kids look up to you and respect you because you're something rather than nothing. And at the moment, I don't feel like I've got that.
Until he finds that, 20 years of skills will go neglected, swapped for a job sorting mail. Mō te hōtaka o te ata, ko Kate Newton tēnei.
Now, we've just got an update on this story since she spoke to RNZ. Teresa Gooch has found work at a bakery on minimum wages. Teresa still hopes she can eventually start a new career in support work. You can read more about the effects of redundancy on people's lives on RNZ's In-Depth section, which launches today. It's long-form journalism on our website, rnz.co.nz. In-Depth, it is called. Let's go to Myanmar, where a judge has found 2 Reuters journalists guilty of breaching a law on state secrets and sentenced them to 7 years in prison in a landmark case seen as a test of progress towards democracy in the Southeast Asian country. Wallone and Jaw Soyu were judged to have breached the colonial-era Official Secrets Act when they obtained confidential documents. Both had been working on stories regarding the Burmese army's violence against Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine State, in particular the documented massacre of 10 men from one village. Reuters broke that story and they were correct. The journalists were arrested shortly after a dinner in a Yangon restaurant, during which police officers handed them what they described as classified documents. The case is widely regarded as blatant entrapment and seen as a test of progress towards democracy in Myanmar, which has introduced a raft of repressive laws aimed at the media over the last 2 years. Kevin Krolicki is Reuters regional editor for Asia.
What happened today threatens to undermine the rule of law and the freedom of press that democracy requires. Anyone who knows Wallone and Chosu, anyone who has read their work and benefited from it, anyone who's followed this trial understands that they share a professional commitment to reporting impartially, to reporting fairly, to establishing facts and sometimes telling hard truths. But they also do that out of a deep belief that that is their fullest contribution to democracy. The government of Myanmar now has an opportunity and a responsibility to do the right thing and to free Wallone and Chosu. We'll be doing everything. We'll be pursuing every avenue open to us.
That's Kevin Krolicki, who's Reuters regional editor for Asia. The BBC's Jonathan Head has been following the trial and says today marks a step backward for press freedom in Myanmar.
I think given the almost comic absurdity of the case that was made by the police during court proceedings, there was a lot of hope that the judge would find these 2 not guilty. But remember, there's always a political dimension. These 2 journalists are unusual in the degree to which they were able to expose what was going on in Rakhine State. There have been multiple investigations with compelling testimony from the thousands of refugees who fled to Bangladesh That is the basis mostly of the UN's report, bringing up these claims of genocide. But these two journalists had actually got sources from inside Rakhine State and from inside the security forces, which were much harder for the government to dismiss. They've generally dismissed all these reports of atrocities in Rakhine as refugees lying or exaggerating, but it's a bit harder when it's coming from your own security forces. So the investigation these two journalists were conducting was deeply embarrassing. About the time they were ready to publish, they were suddenly slapped with these charges. Their lawyer had testified, and they had as well themselves, that in fact they were in effect entrapped. They were invited to a meeting by the police, handed documents, they didn't even read them, and they were immediately arrested. It is a very sweeping law, this colonial-era Official Secrets Act. It doesn't even require that the actions threaten national security, so I suppose the judge has given a very broad reading of it, but it is very shocking to those who see this as an attack on Myanmar's recently won media freedoms and a terrible blow for two young men with young families.
The BBC's Jonathan Head, 7 years. They received home again with the time at 5:45. It's been revealed that key parts of the Pike River mine's electrical infrastructure could have survived the multiple explosions that shook the mine close to 8 years ago. Media were briefed today by the Pike River Recovery Agency on progress so far and coming up with a safe means of carrying out a manned re-entry as far as a huge rockfall. This is up the drift, remember. It's not into the mine workings proper. The agency's Chief Operating Officer, Dingy Pattinson, told Conan Young an area of interest will be the 400-metre network of tunnels off to the side of the entry tunnel that could hold important clues as to what caused the original explosion.
While a lot of focus has been on recovering the bodies of the 29 men who died in the mine, of equal importance to the families and authorities is trying to work out why it exploded. The Pike River Recovery Minister, Andrew Little, says if this can be established, then manslaughter charges could follow, something a number of the families have been fighting for. Today, the man leading the recovery operation, Dingy Pattinson, said numerous inquiries, including a royal commission, had established there were dangerous levels of methane in the mine, but had so far not been able to work out the ignition source.
There was about 5 or so different options, I suppose, that they said could have caused the explosion. Now, whether we can find out what caused it, who knows, but we might be able to eliminate some of those options.
So what could have caused the explosion? Options include a diesel engine overheating, contraband taken into the mine such as cigarettes, electric motors or frictional sparking caused by work being done in the mine. Another possibility, and the one Dingy Pattinson is hoping to count in or out by re-entering the entry tunnel, is arcing in the mine's electrical system. This is contained in a little talked about series of tunnels off to the side of the main entry tunnel, known as pit bottom in stone.
That's an unknown what condition the equipment will be in, because there has been 4 explosions through that mine. A lot of the gear in the pit bottom in stone area may still be intact because that was out of a direct line of a blast.
For anybody who saw the footage of the debris being blown out of the mine portal or the flames leaping from the ventilation shaft, it seems incredible that anything could have survived intact following those 4 explosions. But Mr. Pattinson says methane blasts tend to travel in a relatively straight line.
The blast actually goes for its point of exit, so the main blast would have gone out of a main tunnel entrance, as you've seen in the video footage at the time of explosion, and some of it would have gone up a vent shaft as well.
But wouldn't it necessarily have gone either side, which is where the pit bottom and stone is?
No, there was some pressure would have gone, some overpressure would have gone around those roadways, but the bulk of it would have gone straight out the direction of the tunnel.
The existence of this network of tunnels off to the side of the entry tunnel is what saved Daniel Rockhouse that day. He was refuelling his vehicle in this part of the mine when the explosion shot up the tunnel, knocking him to the ground but leaving him able to walk out to safety. Dingy Pattinson says if they get the go-ahead, a 6-strong team of forensic investigators will spend a considerable amount of time poring over the mine's electrical system here, along with Daniel Rockhouse's vehicle, which remains where he left it nearly 8 years ago.
The whole purpose of a recovery is, and I see our role there is to support the police. It is a crime scene, and we're trying to find out if we can help in finding out what happened, what went wrong.
Starting next week, a risk analysis of the entry plan will be done. This will then be reviewed by a fresh set of eyes before a final plan is presented to the Minister for final sign-off at the end of October. For Checkpoint, ko Konanyang tēnei.
Parents and early childhood teachers in Wellington are fed up with what they describe as jaw-dropping and ridiculous delays in getting specialist support for preschoolers with disabilities. They say those under 5 with special needs are waiting up to a year for help, and many are nearly ready for school by the time they get the assistance they need, the preschool assistance they need. The Education Ministry says it now has the funding to get more than halve its waiting list, and waiting times will come down as it hires more staff. Looking at this is our education correspondent, John Gerritsen.
Yana Gray's 3-year-old son Caden needs specialist help for delayed social and verbal skills. But the length of the waiting list means Caden won't get help until after he turns 4.
I've roughly been told about 8 months waiting list, which really is hard for us because he's 3 at the moment. And so when and if he is able to get into this, he's not going to be able to reap the rewards of the system itself in place before school can start.
Yana Gray hopes Caden will eventually get the one-on-one support he needs, but the delay is hard to take.
Pretty jaw-dropping. It's more something that you want to deal with now rather than later, because early childhood years are the most precious years and you develop so much so fast.
Caden is among 2,500 children on the early intervention waiting list, 300 fewer than last year. But because he lives in the Wellington region, he's facing a longer delay than children in other areas. The capital's average waiting time in 2017-18 was 196 days, that's 6 months, up from 131 days the previous year, and double the national average of 99 days. Serene Scarhill from Cottle Kindergarten in Upper Hutt says under 5s shouldn't have to wait so long for help.
Waiting lists, they just don't work in early childhood because you have to do something straight away for their development. And children's brain development and their physical development, everything is really happening at that time, and all research shows that's the case. So that's what's happening. We're losing that opportunity that really we've got.
Serene Scarhill says the delays are frustrating. She has to tell parents they'll have to wait 6 or 8 months for help, but sometimes it's even longer.
We have a child at the moment who's waited a year, and now she's receiving services, but she goes to school at the beginning of next year. So even though we made a referral 18 months ago, she's receiving only 6 months of early intervention.
David Wales from the Education Ministry says a combination of factors have caused Wellington's long waiting times.
In Wellington, there's been some historical ways of working with those young people and in organising the work, and we're really focused now on getting a better way of working. We've also had some vacancies in the Wellington region that we're seeking to address so that we can get up to speed there.
David Wales says waiting times will fall around the country because the government's budget in May included $21.5 million over the next 4 years, specifically for the early intervention service. Mo te hōtaka o te ahi, ko John Gerritsen tēnei.
It's coming up to 7 minutes to 6. A detainee inside Australia's Yonge Hill Detention Centre says he's scared there will be more riots and more significant consequences. Emergency services were deployed to the Falcon compound in Perth last night after detainees set fire to buildings following a self-harm incident. An advocate for New Zealanders detained in Australia says those at the centre are now feeling exhausted and helpless. Katie Scotcher reports.
Riots and fires erupting at the Yonge Hill Immigration Detention Centre in Perth. The fires, which were started by detainees, left a number of accommodation units at the centre damaged. Philippa Payne from detainee advocacy group Iwi and Oz says the incident was sparked after a detainee self-harmed.
A group of friends of the gentleman were very upset by the situation, and it kind of escalated to the point now that the whole detention centre is on fire.
It's believed the detainee was a 22-year-old Iraqi man. An Australian Border Force spokesperson says the detainee was taken to hospital and is receiving appropriate medical treatment. Ali Eustace is originally from Iraq and has been held at the Yonge Hill Detention Centre for just over a year. He says he hid in a room with other detainees.
We ended up 7 people in one room hiding, so we can help each other and stick together so we don't get actually hit or punched or get burned inside your room by yourself or getting jumped because you're by yourself. And we hiding in the room and we just watching it from the window, everything lit up at the front of us, and we couldn't do nothing.
Ali Yusuf says there has been talk of further riots, but he's unsure how successful they will be as security has tightened up.
Probably later on, next hour or next two, they're going to get more staff here in the centre and officers to actually get things on control. Not like last night was in the whole compound against the 300 detainees, whole compound only 4 officers. What are they going to do 4 officers against the 300 detainees?
In a statement, the Australia Border Force said all detainees and staff are accounted for and safe, and there have been no reported injuries. They said violent and aggressive behaviour within the centres will not be tolerated, and it will take appropriate steps to stamp out such activity. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Katie Scotcher tēnei.
Just before we move on, we are hearing from staff at Unitec. You can deal with us in confidence. We are interested in the process of dealing with people over job losses. Do text us 2101 or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. We are hearing from people. Thank you. It's 4.5 minutes to 6. Let's go to Singapore, which has the lowest birth rate in the world, just over 1 live birth per woman. The trend has been going down for years, and the government is so concerned about it, it's now trying to play matchmaker and is paying people to go on dates. The BBC's Katie Silver is in Singapore, and Katie filed this report.
Young Singaporeans enjoying a night out.
All the table tags, guys, when you rotate, do me a favour.
Speed dating is all the rage, but here it's being subsidised by the government as a way to get young people to meet.
The government really wants to get guys and girls to get together, to form families.
Coming here, I hope to expand my social network and coming to make friends, and hopefully I can meet someone that's suitable.
These dating nights are just one of a number of solutions, including tax breaks, baby bonuses and preferential housing that the government is using to combat the country's low birth rate.
Morning, Doctor.
Ivy and her husband Keen are in their 4th cycle of IVF, and half the costs were subsidised by the state.
I just get emotional. I just start crying for no reason. It's also financially difficult. If we don't have a subsidy, we won't even think of going to the IVF.
Despite years of intervention, there's little progress in getting the country's birth rate up. It's partly down to women marrying later, but the increasing cost of living here and cultural expectations that women will take care of ageing parents are also putting them off. It's these sacrifices that mean women like Bun Siu, who received government-subsidised IVF, are still unlikely to have more than one child.
I'm a sole caregiver of this baby. It's not easy for me, and I think I'm already contented with one.
In just 18 years, Singapore will shrink from having 6 workers for each elderly person down to just 2. And the consequences of this for the country's future are dire. Fewer people of working age makes it harder for the economy to grow, and they'll face the increasing burden of having to pay for a growing number of elderly people.
One population expert says the reason government interventions aren't working is they don't get to the heart of the problem.
In Singapore, you have about 17 to 18% of young people never married. So that's one of highest probably in the world in terms of singleness rate. So you really need to think about why people are not getting married.
But time is running out. Policymakers are now targeting the other end of the age spectrum, getting older people to work longer.
That report from the BBC about 1.5 minutes before 6. We're getting a lot of feedback. We're hearing from people who work at Unitec and have worked at Unitec, people describing the situation by which the tertiary institution in Auckland's 2 campuses, both to the west of the city, the process by which it got into so much financial trouble. We're also hearing from staff there. We really would like to deal with you in confidence about the process of hearing that you are going to be made redundant and how far advanced that process is. 2101, or if you'd prefer to email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. We interviewed Maren Davis earlier in the program. Someone asked after that interview, is the Masters of Waffle being cut? In terms of Eddie's story about the guy who was selling driver's licences and was sentenced to home detention today, this person, Roland, makes a good point. The point that the judge really missed with the sentencing of the licence fraudster was the damage to our public service. We don't have a system of bribery in our bureaucracy, and long may that be the case. Thank you, Roland. The judge may have made the point. It would have been a long sentencing thing, longer than Eddie could fit into his excellent package. Lots of people saying it's great that you're focusing on Nauru. Don't forget West Papua in your coverage of the Pacific Islands Forum. Thank you for that. We will be talking with the president of the organisation responsible for the latest report on Nauru after the news at 6. Bipartisan support for these offshore detention centres in Australia. A lot of public support for it in Australia, and I discussed that with Phil Glennington after the news, which is next.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui, good evening. Ko Katrina Bat and DNA. As many as 200 jobs are being axed at Unitec as the beleaguered tertiary institution suspends 19 courses in full and 3 others in part. Unitec's acting chief executive, Maren Davis, says some courses have been suspended because they're not fit for purpose. She told Checkpoint the institution has about 1,000 full-time equivalent staff and 1,800 part-time staff, and overall costs will need to be reduced by about 20%.
We're expecting anywhere between 100 and a couple of hundred jobs, full-time equivalent jobs, right across the organisation. There is an understanding and an expectation that there will be job losses.
Maren Davis. Unitec says it won't be enrolling any new students, but those currently enrolled will be able to complete their qualifications. A former Automobile Association worker has escaped jail after admitted to taking bribes in exchange for issuing driver's licences. Lovepreet Brar was sentenced to 11 months home detention today when he appeared in the Manukau District Court, having earlier pleaded guilty to a representative charge of obtaining by deception. Edward Gay reports.
Brar worked in customer service for the AA, processing payments from people who wanted to sit their driver's licence. Judge Anna Johns said that in 2014 he was recruited into a group who were taking bribes in exchange for licences. She said the police could prove he took bribes on at least 107 occasions and kept $56,000 for himself. 3 other defendants are still before the courts. I Tamaki Makoto ko Edward Gaiaho.
Campaigners fighting for the living wage throughout the country are delighted that the Wellington City Council is officially on board. Today, the council was given accreditation as a living wage employer, and it plans to eventually extend the wage to its contractors as well. A Living Wage Aotearoa spokesperson, Lindy McIntyre, says it's an historic day.
It's the biggest living wage employer and it's the first council to come on board. But for the people of Wellington, it's also fantastic news because the people of Wellington have been behind this for the 5 to 6 years that we've been campaigning to make it happen.
Lindy McIntyre says she hopes more businesses follow in the council's footsteps. A Christchurch City councillor is accusing council staff of knowingly tampering with the district plan. David East says a policy enabling people to move, renovate or extend their homes in South New Brighton, South Shore and Redcliffs was at some stage omitted from planning provisions. He's calling for an independent investigation, saying the omission has caused unnecessary financial stress and affected the health of property owners. Mr East says he can't be sure who got rid of the clause, but believes it was one of the staff.
It is not an indictment on the Mayor. You could say it's an indictment on the Council as a whole. At this stage I have no idea of the identity of such persons, so it would be remiss of me to say that any particular person, let alone the Mayor, was responsible.
David East. The Council's acting chief executive, Brendan Ansitz, says that when staff met with Mr East recently, he had the opportunity to talk about the clause. He says it's hugely disappointing that Mr East has acted inappropriately by making such a serious accusation without any basis in fact. A Myanmar judge has found 2 Reuters journalists guilty of collecting state secrets and sentenced them to 7 years in prison. The men's lawyers say they'll appeal their sentences immediately. Graham Acton reports.
In the period before their arrest last December, Wah Lone and Jaw Soy Oo were investigating a massacre of 10 Rohingya Muslims by Myanmar security forces in northern Rakhine State. Both men were arrested shortly after a dinner in a Yangon restaurant, during which police officers handed them papers deemed to be classified. The case is widely regarded as a blatant case of entrapment and has been seen as a test of progress towards democracy in Myanmar, which has introduced a raft of repressive laws aimed at the media over the last 2 years. Ko Graham Acton, Tēnei.
A polar blast that has buffeted the lower half of the north of the country is now moving north, and parts of the east coast can expect heavy rain in coming days. A severe weather warning is in place for strong southerlies around Wellington, the Marlborough Sounds and the Kaikoura coast until tomorrow morning. 4 Blue Bridge ferry sailings today and 2 tomorrow have been cancelled. The Inter-Islander leaving Picton at 6:45 tonight and the one leaving Wellington at 8:30 will carry freight only. Met Service says Wairarapa, Hawke's Bay and Wellington can expect more rain this week. It's exactly 6:05. Sport, the All Blacks lock Brodie Retallick says playing at a venue they've never played a test at before is a refreshing proposition for the side. Nelson hosts its first All Blacks test this weekend against Argentina. Retallick says the players have already noticed how excited the city is for the test against the Pumas.
I think it's a big one. It's probably pretty huge. Like, obviously we're pretty lucky to play in the big cities quite often throughout New Zealand, but coming to Nelson, you know, when you arrive at the airport, everyone's saying good day to you, everyone's excited to have the All Blacks here and test match rugby in Nelson.
Brodie Retallick. The Silver Ferns mid-quarter Laura Langman is returning to play for the Australian domestic netball champions, the Sunshine Coast Lightning. Netball New Zealand didn't allow her to play for the Ferns last year as she was based overseas. However, she took a break from the game this year, not playing in Australia or at international level. Netball New Zealand has now relaxed its eligibility qualifications and granted her a 12-month exemption so she can now play in Australia and for the Silver Ferns. Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic will be one step away from a quarter-final clash when the US Tennis Open resumes tomorrow. Federer, the second seed, plays Australian John Millman in the last 16, while sixth-seeded Djokovic faces the unseeded Portuguese João Sousa. That's the news.
The proof is in the pudding? What is this, a cooking show or what? If you have a nice proof, no mathematical equations and watch out, it is the new theory of relativity.
Nights with Brian Crump, Monday to Fridays after the news at 7.
You want to put it in pudding, Einstein?
On RNZ National.
The common problem for retired men, underfoot syndrome.
The ladies find it quite stressful. You might be hanging up the washing and the husband standing beside her putting the pegs on just because he's bored.
It's Lately with Karen Hay, 10 p.m. weeknights on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Whanganui, also Coromandel Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Showers, some heavy with possible thunderstorms today, clearing in the west from Northland to Taumaranui tomorrow evening. Snow may affect the desert road tonight and tomorrow morning. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, scattered showers turning to rain tomorrow with possible thunderstorms and hail. Manawatu to Wellington, also Wairarapa and Marlborough. Rain spreading north this evening, heavy at times. Severe southerly gales in exposed places for a time, I should say. Nelson, Bulla and North Westland, scattered rain gradually clearing today. For the remainder of Westland, also Fiordland, fine apart from a few showers in southern Fiordland. Canterbury, Southland and Otago, a few showers, but mainly dry about central Otago, clearing south of Christchurch tomorrow, and the Chatham Islands occasional showers. It's 8 minutes past 6 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten, and thank you everyone for being with us. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has defended her decision to fly to Nauru for just one day rather than spend the full 3 days there that other ministers and leaders are doing. Ms Ardern will leave New Zealand at 2 on Wednesday morning to attend the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Retreat and then return at 11:30 that night. It's a long way north, Nauru, up east of Papua New Guinea, east or west of Papua New Guinea. It's a hell of a long way north. She says she spent a lot of time deliberating about whether to go at all, given her commitments to her 11-week-old daughter, Neve.
I spent quite a bit of time deliberating over whether or not I would attend the Pacific Island Forum in Nauru. I analysed all of my options. I'm not in a position at the stage of Neve being just 11 weeks old to have travelled with her, because she would not have all of the immunisations required to travel with me. The other option was for me to not attend at all, but given the importance that we place on our relationships with the Pacific Islands in the reset, that equally didn't feel like an option. When weighing up therefore the logistics around travel, I asked officials to check what extra costs I would be imposing on the Crown if I were travelling separately. They assured me that because of the 757 not being able to remain on Nauru anyway, but having to leave the island so other planes could come in and depart, and also the fact that if it wasn't flying there, it would be taking up hours somewhere else anyway, that on balance I decided it was worth me travelling for the full day on the Wednesday in order to fulfil my obligations as Prime Minister, both here but also in representing New Zealand at the Pacific Island Forum.
Jacinda Ardern speaking at the Beehive not terribly long ago. Nauru is, of course, northeast of Papua New Guinea. In Nauru itself, the issue is that people want to leave the tiny Micronesian island. Nauru is an economic disaster, with the government accused of being anti-democratic on good days and corrupt on bad days. It's also home to the Australian Offshore Detention Centre, of course, where roughly 900 people are being held, 109 of them children. Now, last week, Checkpoint spoke to a New Zealand psychiatrist who'd worked on Nauru with the youngest asylum seekers, child and adolescent psychiatrist. He detailed depression, anxiety, self-harm and what's called resignation syndrome, effectively a psychological withdrawal so great it's almost a form of shutdown. Today, that and more was put in writing by the Refugee Council of Australia and Refugee Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, a report utterly damning of the centre itself and of Australia's continued use of it. The report's been released today for maximum impact as Pacific leaders begin gathering for the forum. Phil Glendinning is president of the Refugee Council of Australia.
I mean, the situation is dire. We've got children as young as 7 and 12 experiencing repeated incidents of suicide attempts, dousing themselves in petrol, becoming catatonic. And there are 109 children there at the moment, we believe. At least 2 people have killed themselves. Another 3 have died. Many more are trying to kill or harm themselves. The situation, quite simply, is that people have lost hope, and many of the experts that we've been talking to tell us that they believe that people that they've seen there are more traumatised than those in war zones or in refugee camps around the world. It's a very, very serious situation, and you know, we've got to a point in Australia, John, where we don't know what's going to move our government, because this policy has bipartisan support. We had an offer from the United States to resettle up to 1,250 people, but only 335 of them have left, almost 2 years since that agreement's been made. We know that the New Zealand government has been fabulous and has offered 150 people, but even Australia at this stage is pushing back against that. Let alone what the whole situation is doing also to the people of Nauru, who are our neighbours, and we're treating them like a third-rate colony. This will, in the years to come, we will look back at this period of Australian history and wonder what on earth we were doing. And it's my belief that a Prime Minister will rise in the Parliament one day and make a formal apology on behalf of the nation, and there will be millions and millions of dollars of compensation that will need to be paid. The problem with this is if you go to jail and you commit a crime, you know when you're going to get out. But if you attempt to come to Australia and you are then removed to Nauru and to Manus, you've got no idea when you're getting out. You're not charged with anything, and your liberty's taken away. These are very, very dire days for us.
And if I look at the report, page 13 asks the question, getting them out and how that will happen. And to be frank, you kind of draw a blank on it. There was a suggestion that America would take more, but under Trump, and these are people who've been certified as refugees, refugees, absolutely legitimate and authentic refugees. So, but under Trump, that door is closing. I was interested to see in the report that since September 2017, so this time last year, roughly 30 people have been transferred to Taiwan. What's that arrangement?
Well, that's one that's been sort of done on the QT, as they say. We've had groups of people who have gone to Taiwan for medical care. And some then have been able to stay on. We've also had people being sent to Cambodia. 7 people were sent to Cambodia, but we now believe only 1 is reported to still be there. This is effectively outsourcing Australia's moral and legal obligations. I mean, under our law, if someone comes to this country to seek asylum, it's a perfectly legal thing to do, and they are entitled to have their claims assessed. This is in complete breach of our obligations, morally, legally, and as a decent country at the moment, when the refugees right around the world we're looking at up to 60 million or so, and the numbers coming to Australia are tiny. Yet we do this to them.
I want to go back to the fact it's bipartisan. In fact, it's been bipartisan since the Pacific Solution in 2001. So this isn't just a very conservative right-wing government doing this. This has support from the Labor Party and has done since 2001. So how is Australia going to address this when basically all the parties in Parliament except the Greens support it?
Yeah, that's true. The Labor Party, however, and I'm not. You're right. The history has been bipartisan. The Labor Party are claiming that they would get everybody off. Now, I think, and we're asking them how they're going to do that, and that's when the conversation comes to an end. But they are claiming that they would be getting people off. They're confident that they could resettle people. So this now becomes an issue for the Australian people, I think, to rise up and get a people's movement rolling that says to Australians, we've had enough of this. We're not going to put up with it any longer. If our politicians aren't up to it, the people are going to have to be.
But always beneath that in Australian life is the subtext of the line that Peter Dutton runs, and we've tried many, many times to talk to Peter Dutton, and that is, how many refugees did you say a couple of minutes ago were on the planet at the moment?
About 63 million.
Right, and so Peter Dutton...
62 million who are displaced, and about 24 million of them are refugees.
Right, so Peter Dutton will say, if you let these people off Nauru, they will all get in boats and head for Australia.
Yeah, well, that immediately says that the Australian military, which are up there and stopping boats, are basically incompetent. The bottom line here, though, is if you actually helped people before they got in a boat, like the Fraser government did, like the Whitlam government did, like the Hawke government did, when they acted in a bipartisan way, when there were far more people in boats heading towards Australia after the Vietnam War. The politicians got together then and decided that you would assist people in the region before they got in a boat, and they managed to resettle some 2.1 million people in 8 years all around the world, and including a good number that have come to Australia and have been wonderful citizens. So we know historically how you are able to fix this. My concern is that some of the politicians and the minister who sees himself as the nation's policeman were quite happy to use these people's situation for domestic political gain. This has been seen as a way of winning a marginal seat in the western suburbs of Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne. And it's, and that's as simple as that, frankly.
One final question. If it is seen as a way of winning a marginal seat in the western suburbs of Sydney, for example, doesn't that speak to the fact that this is scratching an Australian itch? I mean, doesn't it speak to the fact that actually what's happening in Nauru is supported by a significant number of Australian people?
Well, two things I'd say about that. I think the vast majority of Australian people have been lied to. I think they've been told that somehow by doing this you're tough on people who come by boat, who are tough on people smugglers, when in fact it's like shooting fish in a bucket. The people who come, particularly I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, they're coming for a pretty clear reason, and that is that their lives are in danger and at risk, and they are found, the vast majority of people who come by boat, to actually have valid claims. So I think Australians haven't been told the truth, and part of the reason of keeping them offshore in remote islands from Australia is to keep them away. The second point about this is, the race card does work in this country, tragically. I mean, you won't find many white people in Nauru, and we've just seen the minister here recently has intervened to allow 3 au pairs come who got connections with the people who are putting the application. So, that's the second thing. Historically, we know that. Just ask any Aboriginal person. Now they probably could argue they had a problem with boat people, but we don't. There are solutions to this. The seeds of this, I think, lie in that, as you said, the Australian niche, lie in the unfinished business of our history. You know, the unreconciled Australia. You know, we are nowhere near getting this as right as New Zealand has done, or the United States even, or Canada, Finland. You know, we still have not recognised Indigenous peoples in our constitution, and I think that unfinished business lies at the heart of a lot of this capacity to be harsh and to see people on you know, through the prism of their origin, their race, their creed, their religion, rather than the content and capacity of their character, which actually flies in the face of the Australian reality. We are, when we remain, you know, one of the most successful multicultural nations on the planet. And the vast majority of us, or our ancestors, came here by boat. So I think this is about an underpinning Australian fear of ourselves, because all of those people on Nauru at the moment and those young kids, somewhere in our background, our relatives have done the same thing. And they didn't get this treatment, though.
That's Phil Glendinning, who is the president of the Australian Refugee Council, talking to us earlier this afternoon. Fascinating interview. Obviously, the Prime Minister heading up to Nauru on Wednesday. She will not be able to visit the detention centre, and she will not be able to talk to people who are in it. 6:20, just before we move on, police are currently responding to reports of an explosion and fire at a Henderson address near Swanson Road. This is West Auckland. The report came in just prior to 5 this evening. Fire and emergency are at the scene. No more information from police yet, but a loud explosion has been reported. The Wellington City Council became the first local authority in the country to get accreditation as a living wage employer today, joining another 110 employers across New Zealand. That's because the council is now fully committed to not just paying its staff a living wage, but to paying its contractors $20.55 an hour as well. It comes after a 5-year battle from campaigners. Laura Dooney reports.
We're going to be the first council in New Zealand that is an accredited living wage employer.
Wellington's Mayor Justin Lester was greeted with cheers as dozens gathered to celebrate the council officially becoming the country's largest living wage employer. It may only be a difference of $4.05 an hour between the living and the minimum wage, but for people like Malcolm Hirini, it's life-changing. It's given him time to connect with his family.
I've been able to go down and take part in their festivals and learn about their whakapapa, so I know where I'm from. The living wage has opened up so much for me. I was working so hard as on the minimum wage that you didn't really have time for family. You'd make time, you'd go to stuff, but you're too tired. You'd just fall off to sleep, you know.
Since 2014, the parking warden has been on the living wage, working a 40-hour week and getting to spend more time with his kids. Before that, he was on his feet for between 50 and 70 hours each week.
Because you're working so hard, you miss some of the years. My children are now adults, so I'm doing different things that I would have done before if I'd had the opportunity. Life's good.
Lindy McIntyre has been the driving force behind the living wage campaign in Wellington. She says getting the council on board is an historic moment.
It's the biggest living wage employer and it's the first council to come on board. But for the people of Wellington, it's also fantastic news because the people of Wellington have been behind this for the 5 to 6 years that we've been campaigning to make it happen.
But she says there's still work to do in making sure everyone's paid a decent wage.
Let's start with the wealthy corporates. Let's start with the big banks, for example. Can they afford to pay their lowest paid workers the living wage? I think they can. And we'd really like to see them lead the way.
Mayor Justin Lester says it's been 5 years since the council started paying staff a living wage, but he's proud it has been able to commit to rolling it out to the rest of its contractors.
When employees are on a minimum wage and if they've worked for your organisation for a long time, look, it's a very subsistence living. We want to make sure that people feel included, that they can support their children, that they can also afford to have some time in the day because they can hopefully work fewer hours rather than 60 or 70 hours.
Justin Lester says cleaning and security contractors are already getting the living wage, and as old agreements are renewed, they'll become living wage contracts. In Wellington for Checkpoint, ko Laura Dooney tēnei.
Let's cross the Tasman again. It's more than a week since the Liberal Party coup against former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, but there's little evidence the divisions that sparked it are healing. Another round of media leaks today concerning a new national transport package is clearly intended to undermine Mr Turnbull's successor, Scott Morrison. Goodness. The ABC's Tom Ingleton reports.
Reviews from the all-important Senate crossbench are in about the latest leak, and they're not good. Victorian Senator Darren Hinch, speaking on Channel 7, says it's a tit-for-tat reprisal after last week's damaging campaign against Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton.
You've got people leaking the au pair stuff about Dutton. You've got people in Dutton's camp obviously leaking this stuff to try and belittle ScoMo and pull him back a bit.
More than just a bit, says Labor.
This is a farcical operation from a government that's dysfunctional, from a government that's had 3 prime ministers in 5 wasted years.
That's Shadow Transport Minister Anthony Albanese. He too says internal politics is behind the leak.
This quite clearly has been timed to damage the Morrison government, to show when it stands up on future so-called announcements that there's nothing new in it, that these are decisions that were made when Malcolm Turnbull was the Prime Minister.
The leak details billions of dollars worth of transport decisions listed as taken but not yet announced from May's budget. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull appears to have been keeping them in political storage until next year's election. Much of the funding was for rail projects, for example a high-speed rail study for the East Coast, and appears to have been targeted at marginal seats in an attempt to shore up support for the government. Anthony Albanese says the leaker's intention seems to have been to blunt the impact of Scott Morrison making the announcements.
It couldn't be delivered by the Turnbull government, but the Morrison government, the shiny new government, has been able to make this happen. Now, quite clearly, there are people who would have been annoyed at this, so they've leaked what is a very comprehensive budget leak. This is an extraordinary revelation, some $7.6 billion.
And Labor's using the latest infighting to keep the pressure up on Mr Morrison.
This once again reinforces the need for Scott Morrison to stop pretending that somehow he is a new Prime Minister, but to go to an election and seek a mandate from the Australian people. Because at the moment, he has no mandate, and quite frankly, he has no credibility.
Deputy Prime Minister and Transport Minister Michael McCormack says the timing of the election's Mr Morrison's call.
I'm sure Senator are probably running a poll on when the next election is going to be held, and if I knew exactly when the next election was held, maybe everybody be getting on one of those betting agencies.
And he's downplaying the leak.
Yes, some of the papers think they've got a big scoop. Fact is, of course, we've got a list of funding infrastructure. It's a very long list.
But he's not denying some projects on the leaked list would benefit the government whenever an election's called.
Tom Ingleton reporting from Canberra. Just before we go tonight, what were you doing when you were 14 years old? Probably not winning awards at New Zealand Fashion Week. 14-year-old Natasha Senior has taken out the top prize at the Walk the Line catwalk over the weekend. $2,000 scholarship to pursue a career in fashion. Logan Church went to meet her and her award-winning garment.
Natasha Senior is only year 10 at Burnside High School, but she is already making waves in the New Zealand fashion scene. Her garment, consisting of a silver top with homemade flowers and pants made out of wetsuit material, has landed her the crown of Supreme Winner of the YMCA's Walk the Line 2018 at New Zealand Fashion Week. Inspired by the Pacific, Natasha wanted her garment to reflect more than just fabric and thread.
I wanted it to be pretty as well, because the Pacific, we need to protect it because it's our traditions and values, and it's just got everything that New Zealand has to offer. So I had the frangipani flowers, I had the swimsuit material, and I had the linen organza, which kind of looks like the sea when you reflect it in the light.
Natasha's garments took half a year to conceptualise, design and piece together. She may only be 14, but Natasha says she has high dreams.
I really hope to have my own company in the future and sell my clothes to people and make sure they express themselves in New Zealand and overseas, and make sure that I would try something different, not like what's internationally selling and what everyone just wears. I just want something that will be new and fresh.
But no fashionista would be where they are today without a support crew. In Natasha's case, it's her parents. Mum, Irina, says she couldn't be prouder.
Yes, but I don't want a star disease for my child, so I'm just trying to even it out. And
what do you mean by that?
Well, I don't want her to think that it's all about her, but really it is part of her education.
And Irina says all parents should encourage their kids to look at fashion design as a way to learn skills that will prove invaluable later on in life.
I really don't mind who she becomes, a designer, an architect, or any other type of maker, or maybe she will be somebody not related to making industry at all. In the end, we don't know, she's only 14. But at least she will appreciate it, and she will get the brain developed as well in the correct way.
In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Logan Church.
What a nice note to end the program on a clever young New Zealander. Well, two really, because Logan's one himself, isn't he? That's Checkpoint for this evening. Thank you everyone for being with us. We really appreciate the pleasure and privilege of your company. On behalf of our wonderful team, the smiling Jeremy Ansell. Can we have a shot of Jeremy and Kelvin and Pip? Look at what a fine trio. Have a wonderful evening. We'll be back tomorrow at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The struggling Auckland Polytech, Unitec, is slashing up to 200 jobs in at least 19 courses as it tries to cut costs by 1/5. A former Automobile Association worker who took $56,000 in bribes for driver's licences has been sentenced to home detention. And Fire and Emergency are at a scene of an explosion and fire at an address near Swanson Road in Henderson, West Auckland. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Wake up and face the day with Daybreak on RNZ Concert weekday mornings from 6. I'm Cynthia Morahan and I'll be brewing up a special blend of classics to give just the right kind of energy to your morning. Daybreak, the perfect overture to a new day. Weekday mornings from 6 till 9.